My name is David Schaefer, Managing Director of the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage. Every year on MLK Day, we open our doors for free to honor Dr. King, celebrating his life and legacy with programs on issues of civil rights and the right to vote. Many of you remember a few years ago we produced an important exhibit on Freedom Summer called This Light of Ours. Activists, photographers from the civil rights movement. That exhibit continues to be close to my heart as we fight together for equal rights and justice. And there is no one who can move me the way Reverend Dr. Otis Maltz does. He touches my soul when he speaks. He has provided me with sage counsel over the many years we've known each other. Reverend Maltz is a founding member of the Maltz Museum when we opened the doors 15 years ago, as a museum that celebrates diversity and making our world a better place. I'm honored to stand before you on this important day, on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, to welcome Reverend Maltz to the temple, where in a few moments we will hear from another friend of the museum, Rabbi Jonathan Cohen. But before I leave you, I want to announce publicly for the very first time that the Maltz Museum believes the voice of Reverend Maltz needs to be heard by audiences long into the future, after we're all gone. That is why we are investing in cutting-edge technology to preserve Reverend Maltz's story of fighting for civil rights in America through the development of an interactive biography. What does that mean, an interactive biography? We have engaged in the process of working with the esteemed Sharon Milligan, also here with us today, to interview Reverend Maltz. His stories and memories in the fight for civil rights, his experiences facing and standing up to racism, and his wisdom passed down to all of us. Using state-of-the-art technology, he will be recorded so that future generations, including thousands of young people, will be able to hear Reverend Maltz's perspective on a transformative era in American history. They will be able to ask him questions, and because this is an interactive biography, he will also answer their questions in real time. This project will carry forward the museum's mission to bring people together in a common cause against hate in all its forms. History is coming to life at the Maltz Museum. We are so proud to partner with everyone who made today possible. Reverend Maltz and Edwina, thank you. Sharon Milligan, thank you. Our public officials, thank you for joining us, for supporting our effort to build bridges of tolerance and inclusion across Northeast Ohio. Rabbi Cohen and the Temple Tifereth Israel, thank you for hosting this tremendous event. Thank you to the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, Community Relations Committee, for your generous support today and partnership throughout the year. To our community partners, ADL Cleveland, Bridges Black Heritage Cultural Center, Cleveland Jewish News, the Diversity Center of Cleveland, Roots of American Music, Safety Preserving Families, United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, and the Western Reserve Area Agency on Aging. We thank you all for everything you do every day to make the world a better place. We hope you enjoyed today's program and that you will join us after at the museum for gallery tours, arts and crafts, live music, a film screening, and so much more. Rabbi Cohen, the stage is yours.
David, thank you so much. Thank you all so much. I have been waiting for this day. Reverend Maltz, my father was born in Jerusalem in 1934, and my mother in Vienna in 1936. And you were born in LaGrange, Georgia, in 1935, right between my two parents. The lives of my two parents were lives that were animated by a fight against the hatred of the Jew, against racism, for a better tomorrow, for a better world, for more inclusive communities. And your life has been animated by the very same battle here in the United States of America. Through your time in Georgia, in Morehouse College, and then the theological school, through your time in Cincinnati, in Laughlin, in Mount Zion, Union Theological, through that period in the late 50s in the Interdenominational Theological Center that was led by an extraordinary theologian. But at that time in Morehouse College, you were taught and you were mentored by Benjamin Mays, who also mentored and taught the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And we remember his words. And we especially today remember his words in the eulogy of the Reverend Martin Luther King when he was assassinated in 1968. We remember he said, responding to the notion that Martin Luther King Jr. was a man ahead of his time. Every man is within his star, each in his time, and each man must respond to the call of God in his lifetime. There are moments wherein the stars are obscured by darkness. There are moments wherein the stars are not quite so evident to us as they might be at others. We live at such a time wherein the cloud and the darkness obscures the stars. We need your voice here today to allow the starlight to penetrate through the darkness and the obscurity, to remind us yet again of the values that animate us and of the kind of society, the kind of world that we wish to inhabit for our sakes and for the sakes of our children and grandchildren. We are in this with you together, Reverend Moss. I welcome you to this podium.
Thank you very kindly. And thanks to each of you present and those with us in spirit and those watching us from eternity. Thank you, David, and a special appreciation to the Maltz Museum, its founders, the Maltz, and those who serve and carry on its programs and purposes in such an outstanding way. Thank you, David, for your hospitality and your good works. I could not stand here without giving special appreciation to an extraordinary individual named Edwina Moss. We met in the civil rights struggle, the civil rights and human rights struggle, and many of you know we were united in marriage by Dr. King, and my major professor in college, the late Dr. Samuel Williams, who had been a major professor in Dr. King's student days at Morehouse, and also the individual who took the city of Atlanta into federal court, and that court case desegregated the buses in Atlanta, Georgia. The late Dr. Samuel Woodrow Wilson, who was pastor of Atlanta's most historic church, Friendship, and professor of philosophy and religion, and president of the NAACP, Atlanta. Thank you, Rabbi Cohen, and in a special way, we are indebted to you. Just a few years ago, when you were dean at Hebrew Union College, I was honored by this historic institution with an honorary doctorate degree. And while there, I had a chance to make a quick walk through some of the archives and the library, and it was amazing to see in living color and record so much of the recording, photographs, and writings related to the era of our time in Cincinnati, Ohio. Time is too brief and urgent for me to go on with these preliminaries because I do not want to get into that zone of one of my elders they tell me about, who got up to speak and he kept saying, "I left my watch at home. I might go a little longer." And he spoke 45 minutes and he said, "I left my watch at home." And he spoke another 45 minutes. And one of the anxious deacons said, "Well, Reverend, I have a calendar." So I don't want you to have to turn to your calendar. But I do want to thank those present today from Olivet, a place so close to our hearts where we were blessed to serve for 33 years and continue to have a beautiful relationship with the pastor, the first lady, and the members of this wonderful congregation. Greetings from our family, our son Kevin, who is a member of this community and one of the managers with our energy company, and Otis III, who will be here in a few days to be honored by a distinguished organization that you know well. In our struggle and in our spiritual and religious experience, and especially in the liberation struggle, it is not strange or unusual that we would find a special relationship with the Exodus and the prophets of Israel as we move to the Christian scriptures. The prophets speak to our struggle in a special way, as the Exodus does to our march to liberation. And in the prophets, some would say the latter prophets, and more especially the 8th century prophets, we find the theme, the call, the commitment to justice and liberation in a very special way. Many of you, if not everyone here, you're familiar with the prophet Micah, that familiar 6th chapter and verse 8. What does the Lord demand or require of you? The Lord has told you, O mortal, what is right, what is good, and that is to do justice, to love mercy or kindness, and to walk humbly with the Lord. My Old Testament professor said that Micah attempted or somehow summarized Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah. Love, mercy, justice, liberation, and ultimately reconciliation. And I want to say a few words, excuse me, along those lines today, related to the life and lessons, teachings, and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. In his early years, in his mid-20s, the youngest pastor in Montgomery, Alabama, having received the most dangerous assignment. He received that assignment because most people didn't want it. And those who might have wanted it. There were elders in the community determined that they would not get it. So, an unwanted assignment on the one hand, and an assignment that it was the feeling of the elders, some of the elders in the community, that those older soldiers were not qualified, so they turned to a young prophet. The youngest pastor, perhaps, in Montgomery, Alabama. And with less than 2 years of pastorate at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Dr. King became the leader, the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and he stood up that night, December 5th, 1955, about 3 hours after being elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And one of the things he said in that address was, if we protest with dignity and love, when the historians of the future pause to comment on this hour, they will have to say, there lived a great people, a black people, who injected new meaning into the veins of civilization. This is our challenge. This is our calling. This is our overwhelming responsibility. On that night, Dr. King laid out a moral paradigm, a spiritual presupposition with which he remained consistent for the next 12 and a half years. And in doing this, his life was a continuing lesson, calling, and challenge. It is interesting. Within less than 3 months of this dangerous assignment, Dr. King's father and Mrs. Coretta Scott King's father both tried to get them out of Montgomery. Mrs. King's father drove from his home in Alabama to the parsonage on Jackson Street in Montgomery for the purpose of taking Mrs. King back home in Alabama so she would be safer. That's interesting. And Mrs. King refused. She said, my job and my responsibility is to be with Martin. And perhaps she remembered well that night in their own home when she was a teenager and their house was firebombed. And they hardly escaped the fire, just with the night clothing on their bodies. This is Mrs. King's background in Marion, Alabama. And Mrs. King said, while they were weeping, her father looked at her and said, wait a minute. We don't have time to cry. We have to rebuild this house. It had not finished burning. And out of that kind of experience came Coretta Scott King. Within 30 days of the Montgomery protest, Dr. King was speaking at Fisk University and stopped in Atlanta to visit for a brief period with his parents on his way back to Montgomery. And when he got to Atlanta, Daddy King, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., had already called together all of the leading figures in the black community in his living room. And I think one white lawyer, and their job was to persuade his son, to help him persuade Dr. King not to return to Montgomery, Alabama. And Dr. Mays says, as they went around the room, they were all, except one, in agreement with Daddy King. And eventually, Dr. King stood up and said, with all due respect, I would rather spend 10 years in jail than to turn my back on the people of Montgomery, Alabama now. And at that moment, Dr. Mays stood up and said, Martin is right. He must go back. And a year later, when Dr. Mays conferred upon Dr. King his first honorary degree, he said, Martin Luther King Jr., you are mature beyond your years, wiser at 28 than most people at 60, living a faith that we all preach about but seldom experience. It must have been persons like you that the poet had in mind when he said, look how the masses of men worry themselves into nameless graves, while now and then some unselfish soul forgets himself into immortality. That is the kind of legacy, the kind of calling, the kind of charge Dr. King leaves with us and gives to us at this very hour. It's our assignment to do justice, to love kindness or mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And if we do that, to borrow from Dr. King, when the history books of the future are written, the historians will have to pause and say, there lived a great people who injected new meaning into the veins of Cleveland, the veins of America and the world. Someone has said it is not incumbent upon us to finish the task, neither are we free to desist from doing all that we can while we are able, even though the hour is late, the business is urgent. God has given to us an assignment to let the world know that we are, in the words of Dr. King, interrelated. We are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. And we are called to perform, no, to serve in that kind of circumstance and in that kind of world as long as we live. Someone, speaking of Dr. King, had a kind of, I won't say negative, but a rather doubtful view about our celebrations of Dr. King. He expressed it in a very unique way. And this is the way Hines said it. Now that he is safely dead, let us praise him. Build monuments to his glory. Sing hosannas to his name. Dead men make such convenient heroes. They cannot rise to challenge the images we would fashion from their lives. And besides, it is easier to build monuments than to make a better world. I think we ought to meditate on that challenge. But the late Vincent Harding responded to that poetic challenge by writing a book about Dr. King, and he gave it the title, The Inconvenient Hero. So you could say that we are here today observing the life of an inconvenient hero. So inconvenient that he could come to Cleveland or any major city in America without a gun, without a bodyguard except for Bernard Lee, and he didn't have a gun. One of my friends said, just a briefcase, and in the briefcase, a few personal items, a Bible, and a book by Howard Thurman, and one other book that he was always reading, some challenging text. But with just a briefcase and a few personal items, all of the safety forces in any city went on alert. And the off time for every police force was canceled because a non-violent prophet had come to town just for a few hours. Isn't that remarkable? And yet, he was teaching us what the Lord requires: to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with the Lord. There is a moment in Dr. King's life that I constantly reference, and many of you here have heard me reference it before, and I shall continue to do so. Everybody here has heard, if you have not read, a letter from Birmingham Jail. One of my good friends and theologians said if we were to open up the biblical canon, he would vote to add that letter. And I think I would vote with him. Letter from a Birmingham jail. It was written while Dr. King was locked up in a Birmingham jail. Edwina, you were there when the staff and folk were trying to persuade him not to go to jail. He wrote this letter in response to 6 clergy persons who had criticized him for being in Birmingham and said that his visit, his coming to Birmingham, was unwise and untimely. Isn't that remarkable? Unwise, untimely. So Dr. King wrote the letter in response to clergy persons. But there's another letter that's seldom talked about. It's a letter, a personal letter to Mrs. King from Dr. King while he was in the Georgia Reidsville State Prison. There's a dramatic backstory that time will not permit me to rehearse. But he was sent to prison 4 months, hard labor, for a minor traffic violation while driving in DeKalb County. He was driving. He had just recently moved to Atlanta from Alabama, and his driver's license, his Alabama driver's license, had expired for a few days. And they gave him a ticket. But Dr. King paid the fine. His lawyer took care of it. But when he participated in the sit-in movement with us and went to jail, the folk in DeKalb County said he had violated a probation. And because of this probation violation, it was canceled, and he was now to automatically go to jail, not jail, but to prison. 4 months, hard labor. This meant going to what was then known as the Georgia Chain Gang, public works, which means that he would be out on the roadside cutting trees and digging ditches. We knew that this was a death sentence. While he was there, his courage, his leadership changed the trajectory of the presidential election of 1960, but I will not go into those details. What I want to refer to is the letter he wrote to Mrs. King while he was in the Reidsville State Prison. He starts it out. Hello, darling. Today I find myself a long way from you and the children. I'm in the state prison in Reidsville, which is about 230 miles from Atlanta. They picked me up from the DeKalb County Jail about 4 o'clock this morning. I know this whole experience is very difficult for you to adjust to, especially in your condition of pregnancy. But as I said to you yesterday, which was Monday, this is a cross that we must bear for the freedom of our people. So I urge you to be strong in faith, and this will in turn strengthen me. I can assure you that it is extremely difficult for me to think of being away from you and my Yoki, that is their oldest child, Marty, that's Yolanda and Martin III, he's speaking of, for 4 months. But I'm asking God hourly to give me the power to endure it, the power of endurance. I have, and this to me is the key statement for all time and eternity. I have the faith to believe that this excessive suffering that is now coming to our family will in some way serve to make Atlanta a better city, Georgia a better state, and America a better country. Just how, I do not yet know, but I have the faith to believe it will. If I am correct, then our suffering is not in vain. And then he turns in a peculiar direction, saying to Coretta, when you come to visit me, please bring the following books: Stride Toward Freedom, Dr. King's first book; Paul Tillich's Systematic Theology, volumes 1 and 2. Tillich had not written the third volume. George Buttrick's The Parables of Jesus; E. Stanley Jones' Mahatma Gandhi; Wallace Hamilton's Horns and Halos; a Bible, a dictionary, and my reference dictionary called Increasing Your Word Power. This book is an old book and a red cover, and it may be in the den or upstairs in one of my bags. Also, bring the following sermons from my file: What is man? The three dimensions, the death of evil. Why could not we cast him out? Why Jesus called a man a fool. The Good Samaritan, the peril of the sword. Our God is able. Loving your enemies. The God of the lost. Vision of a world made new. And then he goes on to name other sermons. Also, bring a radio. Now, the remarkable thing here is he does not say a word about a lawyer or a bail bonds person. So this indicates how he was planning to use the 4 months in prison. However, that was an intervention on the part of Senator, who was then candidate, John Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy, who called the judge. And you've heard me say before, when I get into eternity, I'm going to ask Robert Kennedy, what did you say to that judge, because the judge lifted the sentence. Dr. King was released, and when the story was broadcast, 11 million pieces of literature were published, and Nixon was possibly ahead of Kennedy in some areas in double digits. Kennedy won by about 113 to 20,000 votes and became President of the United States of America, and Johnson his Vice President. And when Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson acceded to that office, and in '64 won by landslide. So from a prison cell in Georgia, Dr. King elected 2 presidents. The Lord has shown you what is good and right. And what does the Lord require? But to do justice, to love kindness or mercy, and to walk courageously and humbly with our God. That is our challenge. That is our responsibility. The responsibility to be leaders, not rulers. Let me say that again. There's a great difference between a leader and a ruler. You see, rulers spend so much time loving themselves and praising themselves and rewarding themselves. They don't have much time, any time, to serve others and care for others. Leaders believe in human rights, civil rights, equal rights, universal rights. Rulers destroy rights, feel threatened by human rights, equal rights, and civil rights. Leaders embrace immigrants and strangers and as children of God. Leaders build bridges, open doors, and create ladders for others to climb higher and higher and higher. Rulers build walls, not knowing what they are shutting in and what they are shutting out. Leaders light candles and say, "Bring me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free." Rulers are always looking for more power, more profits, more praise. Leaders know with James Russell Lowell that it's profitable to be just. Leaders know that you cannot unlock the doors of tomorrow with yesterday's rusty keys and bloody keys. Rulers leave a legacy of despair. Leaders leave a legacy of hope anchored in justice, love, and liberation. We must pray, yes, not for more rulers, but for more leaders. Dr. King gives us lasting lessons and leadership through his service, his suffering, his sacrifice. 10 days before Dr. King's assassination, he spoke in New York State before a congregation of rabbis. And he was introduced by his friend, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who had marched with us in Selma. Rabbi Heschel introduced Dr. King that day and said, Martin Luther King Jr. is a voice, a vision, and a way. And then he challenged the rabbis and said, I call upon every Jew to hearken his voice, share his vision, and follow his way. We can expand that and say, we call upon each other to hearken his voice, share his vision, and follow his way. And then Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, the whole future of America will depend upon the impact of Dr. King. The whole future of America will depend upon the impact of Dr. King. And let me close with a familiar kind of challenge. Some of you, especially the members of Olivet, have heard me say it many times. But just for a moment, take a look at your hands. Just open your hands and take a look. Your hands. Your hands. These are God's hands. And the dream is in our hands.
Well, Reverend Moss, I have a watch. I thought you might not know. I have a watch. I am, this is the beginning of many conversations as we prepare to think about history and think about its impact on the future. And I'm really struck by a number of things that you said in your sermon. And one of the things that I think that we often don't think about is how Dr. King predicted the future. And we're living in this present. After all of these years, we are still struggling and aspiring to be able to be where we want to be as a society and with human beings, as human beings, in terms of our own humanity. And as I was listening to you, I thought about the assignment that he took, and with your ending with that this assignment belongs to us. I'm just wondering, I want to ask you a question about what do we need in order to, we want to be kind, loving, but what of this history do we need in order to move forward?
Now you give me a chance to develop some sermons, but I won't do it now. In the last staff meeting, or next to the last, one of the last staff meetings, Dr. King, he gave to the staff a challenge and an illustration of flying from New York to London. And he said, going to London from New York, they developed a tailwind, and they landed in London ahead of schedule. But on the way back to New York, they developed a headwind, and the pilot announced that going to New York, they were facing a headwind which was slowing them down, and they were going to arrive in New York later than scheduled. But the pilot reassured everyone that they had the capacity, the equipment, and everything necessary to make the journey. Some of us here today, Sharon, are old enough to know when we had that tailwind pushing us forward, and allies and support in a very, very special way. And we won victories. We passed civil rights bills. We had coalitions. But today, we are facing a fierce headwind. And it's going to delay some things. But we must keep steady on our course and pass it on to the next generation. We must not panic in the air or on the ground. That's what I see.
As we think about our next generation, so many young people and people who are not so young really don't understand our history as a country. There's so many people that have been left out of the history that we experience in our schools. There are the indigenous people, correct history in terms of African Americans. I mean, that's something that's really missing in order to keep us pushing forward. And you remind us of that in your sermon, how important that was in terms of the Montgomery Improvement Association. It was important to know what the facts were, what the truths were. How do we work with young people in terms of moving them forward and giving them the knowledge of our history when so many are left out of it?
I think, first of all, we've got to love them in all of their ways and moods and rhythms and behaviors. We've got to love them. And if we love them, they, I think, will listen to us when we think they are not listening. And in their listening, I think they will memorize what we think they did not hear. But as the poetic prophet said, your children are not your children. They come through you, but not from you. They are the sons and daughters of life's longing for life. We can, give them our love, but not our dreams. They must dream their own dreams, follow their own star, stumble and fumble, and we must be there to love them still. And don't be surprised if they get to freedom's land ahead of us. Now, that sounds idealistic, but we've got to keep that dream alive. It's amazing how remarkable and how wise our children can be. And we must keep loving, keep struggling, and walking with them day and night.
As you were speaking, I also thought about how in today's society we continue to criminalize protests and engagement in thinking about doing good and doing right. And so many, you mentioned Dr. King going to prison for a minor offense. So many young people and not so young people find themselves picked up by the police in prison for minor offenses.
Mm-hmm.
What wisdom from Martin Luther King's vision can we use to help us think about that? And
years ago, I think it was around 1965, a young man in prison in California wrote a letter to a friend. I have not visited this in 40 years, but he said something in that letter, and he had done some rather brutal things. But in prison, he was finding himself in a new way. And he said, each night, outside of my prison cell, there is one of those large beaming lights, so that when the usual lights out time comes, I can use the external light to read and study. To me, that is redemptive. When the lights within the structure have been turned out, we must be able to read and study and plan and to develop programs and relationships and work on policy and voter registration and work against voter suppression and all of the disabling factors. Even if we are in prison, lights out, there's always some beam coming through, even if it's just a crack or just a candle. Edwina was talking to an individual who made a rather disturbing statement, and yet a loving person. She said to Edwina, you know, I had no idea what happened to the Native Americans. She was honest. She did not know about Native American genocide. It is not a pleasant lesson to teach. And along with that, we have Holocaust denials. And rather than getting better, it tends to get worse. People saying, I don't want to hear about that. I wish it was possible to require every student at the high school level and on or before to take a trip to Africa, to take a trip to Europe, and in those trips make it a special requirement to go to the door of no return, to go to Cape Castle, and in Europe to visit the concentration camps and check out the houses almost next door to the camps where people lived while people burned. And it didn't seem to disturb them. And they don't want to talk about it now. I could give you a few examples, but I will not. That's a long answer to a short question. I'm guilty of doing that. But sounds like an amen from Olivet. I mean, but I think we have to put forth every possible effort to teach each generation, to tell them our story, and to listen to their questions and their challenges. It may not always be easy, but hear them, listen to them, love them, and we can grow together.
Well, I don't have an enviable role at this point, but because we are running out of our time. But I do want to join the audience in thanking you for this wonderful and inspiring presentation and sermon that will hopefully move us into 2020 with great amount of energy and the winds.
And let me thank you. And I must put this in. Thank you, my Spelman sister, for all you do at Case, Western Reserve, and in the community and across the nation.
Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Reverend Moss. Thank you, Sharon. I'd like to call on and welcome from the Ohio Governor's Mike DeWine's office, Mr. Ronald Todd II, and the City of Beechwood Mayor, Martin Horowitz.
Well, they told me I have 45 seconds, and that's hard for a preacher to do 45 seconds, so I'll give you 48 seconds, okay? I want to give greetings and blessings from the Governor, Mike DeWine, and Lieutenant Governor John Husted, and I'm going to give you something that Dr. King has, Dr. Maltz has, and Mike DeWine has, the Governor. It's compassion. What is compassion? You ask good questions. It's sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate it. Compassion. If you heard Dr. Moss, the key term was about compassion, caring for your fellow man. I do have a proclamation to read, but I'm not going to read it. I'll give it to him and later. God bless you. That's an honor as a young preacher. we admire Dr. Maltz, and so it's an honor and privilege to speak in front of Rabbi. Bless you, thank you. June Taylor, thanks for inviting us here today to be here. I came all the way from Cincinnati, Ohio to be here for this occasion, okay? Thank you.
I've also been given the limit of 45 seconds, and seeing as how I'm not a preacher, but I'm a lawyer, I guess I'm just equally as wordy. Reverend Moss, it is an honor to welcome you here to our city. It's an honor to have you here in the city, and we are graced by the words that you gave us this morning on love and hope and justice, both from your historical perspective and everything you've gone through and what you've communicated from Dr. Martin Luther King. To honor this day, I have the privilege of presenting you with a proclamation on behalf of the city of Beechwood, honoring Martin Luther King and declaring this Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Day here in Beechwood, celebrating your history in the civil rights movement and celebrating Dr. King's history, and also the fine work that the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage has done in preparing a very comprehensive and educational and an entertaining program later on this afternoon, which we all hope you join us for. So again, thank you for coming to Beechwood today. We are honored to have you, and we celebrate your life as well as Dr. Martin Luther King.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you to all our partners. Please join us next door, the museum. A lot that's going on. I didn't mention earlier, for those who aren't registered to vote, we have a voter registration table in honor of Reverend Moss and Dr. King. Thank you all.